World War II most famously raged in Europe and the Pacific. The history of intercontinental war is bound to overlook many battles and policies. However, the period of war and occupation in Indochina may be one undeserving of its obscurity. From the disruption of trade, the blurring of alliances, and the setting of dominoes for much of the 20th century, the war in Indochina was an integral part of the Second World War and modern history. Firstly, we need some historical context. In the early 19th century, Southeast Asia was kind of a mess, but to oversimplify, it looks kind of like this. The British under the East Indian Company owned Myanmar, the Dutch were completing their conquest of Indonesia, and the Spanish held the Philippines. But here, in the chunk of Southeast Asia, are the uncolonized kingdoms of Siam and Vietnam. Both are well populated and rich in resources, but what makes them especially valuable to the European powers is their placement in between India and China. Thus, the region became known as Indochina. You see, the trade with China is vital to European colonists, and control over that trade is even more important. So the French, the only major European colonial empire without direct access to China, decides that they should take some land of their own. So, starting in 1858, the French partook in a number of naval and land campaigns up the coast of Vietnam and into the jungles of the Siamese Laos and Cambodia. By 1887, all that we consider French Indochina was conquered, and the French had acquired an important resource and trade colony, especially due to its strategic location directly south of China. Around the same time to the northeast, the long isolated nation of Japan was under severe colonial pressure to concede to trade deals that might have led to the direct colonization of the islands. Yet, Japan, under Emperor Meiji, tactfully maintained their autonomy and reformed its empire in the style of Western colonial nations. However, to play on the same field as the other colonial powers, Japan would need to industrialize, but it had no resources to do so. So, it turned to the weakening Qing China as an opportunity to gain the resources it needed to industrialize. By the 20th century, both French Indochina and Japan were heavily economically dependent on China, but for different reasons. French Indochina mostly exported and sold goods to the wealthy Qing dynasty, while the Empire of Japan imported Chinese goods. This set them down opposing paths even before World War II, starting in 1931 when Japan invaded Manchuria, and once World War II was in full swing, the two entities were poised for conflict.
But why did Japan invade French Indochina? Well, as previously stated, China imported a lot of Indo-Chinese resources, namely weaponry and fuel. This was bad for Japan as their main advantage against China was their ability to end battle swiftly by overwhelming their underdeveloped and often unorganized opponents quickly. If Chinese troops were able to resupply thanks to Indo-Chinese trade, fighting would stall and the Chinese strength and numbers would eventually overwhelm the Japanese. After the fall of France in 1940, Vichy France, what amounted to a Nazi satellite state, took control over Indochina. And as both Japan and Germany were allied, the Vichy administration was forced to concede the northern Dongting region of Vietnam to Japan, so they could regulate the trade between China and the colony. However, in an interesting turn of events, two groups that were on paper allies battled heads, which led to the invasion. It went a bit something like this.
We've got to stop trading with China. You are undermining our war effort. No. Now you've definitely got to stop trading with China. We are allies. No. Oh my God, Germany!
Yeah.
Your stupid French colony won't concede to my trade demands, and it's actively slowing my progress in southern China.
Man, I don't care. I have better things to do. We're all part of Axis. You guys figure it out.
You listen here, you Western imperialist frog eater. You better give us donkey so we can blockade your trade with China, or else we will crush you.
Okay, fine, but do not expect the locals to agree.
Despite the colonial government conceding to Japanese demands, miscommunication and unrest eventually spiraled into the Japanese launching a full invasion of the colony after occupying Dongting. Now, some of you may be wondering, why didn't the Japanese just invade southern China instead of wasting resources fighting what was supposedly an ally? Well, that answer is simple. Most of the trade with China went through Vietnam, which is a long coastal country. This trade started in the northern port of city of Haiphong and went up along the railroad up to Kunming in Yunnan. Yunnan is a heavily fortified mountainous province laying on the Yunnan Guizhou Plateau. When compared to the relatively flat and easily accessible Vietnam, Japan saw it more cost-effective to subdue Vietnam before renewing their conquest of China. As for the other parts of French Indochina, despite also being mountainous, they were relatively rural and underpopulated. With all the population and power along the coast, if Vietnam was occupied, the rest of the Indochina would follow fairly quickly. With all the whys out of the way, let's get to the how. From September 22nd into 26th, the Imperial Japanese Army, or IJA, crossed from China into northern Vietnam, while a naval invasion was done at Haiphong. For more on this, we go to Leonard.
The northern land invasion was a surprise attack on French positions stationed on the northern border. Led by Akito Nakamura, the Japanese land force met the French at Langsong. The three-day battle was a decisive victory for the Japanese, who then bombed the coastal positions in the Gulf of Tonkin from aircraft carriers. By the fourth day, the bombing of Haiphong ended as Japanese troops entered the city, and further south in Sanoi. Japanese pilots captured an airbase and, after receiving reinforcements, took the city. Defeated, the French government agreed to allow Japanese troops to station themselves in Indochina, especially in the north. They also stopped trade with China, and on paper, the Japanese were an allied force simply preparing for further invasions, using Indochina as a staging ground. However, in reality, the Vichy French colonial government no longer had any power in their own colony, as 40,000 Japanese soldiers occupied Indochina.
Before moving on to the 5-year-long occupation of Indochina, let's take a look at the factions in power guiding the actions behind the invasion and occupation. Firstly, there was the Vichy French colonial government under Jean Decoux, who had taken over for the French Republic's Georges Cesclou. The Vichy French government in Indochina, far removed from the battles in Europe, wanted to continue to oppose the Germans and Japanese. However, duty bound to Vichy France under Philippe Pétain, and realizing the French colonial force was no match for the Japanese, decided to take a cautious diplomatic approach to the Axis. On the Axis side, the Japanese military operating in the region led by Akito Nakamura. Publicly, the Japanese aimed to found the East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, a self-sufficient economic bloc headed by Japan. The Japanese justified their increased attention in Indochina as an effort to decolonize the region from their Western imperialist powers. However, the true plans of the Japanese military were to use Indochina to cut off trade with China and use it as a staging ground to launch further invasions of Malaysia and British India. Amidst the colonial empires battling out, local resistance and nationalist groups were founded to resist both the French and Japanese, chief among them the Viet Minh, or what would become the Viet Cong under Ho Chi Minh. Prior to the Japanese occupation, they were not supported by anyone, but during the occupation, the Viet Minh received considerable funding from the Republic of China, France, and ironically, the United States. Finally, the Chinese Republic played an indirect role in the decision made concerning the invasion and occupation. As previously mentioned, after the invasion, both the Chinese nationalists and communists funded resistance groups with Indochina in hopes of reopening trade between the two. Additionally, it was this fuel and arms trade between the two entities that scared Japan into intervening in the region to begin with. In terms of the individual troop numbers, upwards of 5,000 Japanese troops were deployed during the 4-day invasion of Indochina. And after their victory, the IJA occupied Indochina with 40,000 troops, while only 12,000 French troops resided in the colony. An additional 40,000 local Vietnamese soldiers were in the region, but after the successful invasion, many of them turned to the French and Japanese to found their own resistance groups. During the Chinese occupation of French Indochina, roughly 2 million people died, around 500,000 from direct Japanese action, and the additional 1.5 million due to an accidental famine caused by Japanese mismanagement. To figure out what happened, we'll move on to the actual occupation.
After the 4-day invasion ending in Japanese control over northern Vietnam, the Japanese occupied the rest of Indochina. They allowed the Vichy government to stay in power, but under strict supervision. The Japanese forced locals to supply them with resources such as food, munitions, and most importantly for them, coal and fuel. Additionally, the practice of taking comfort women was done throughout Indochina. This extraction of resources, especially food, caused the Vietnamese famine in 1944. In 1945, the Japanese fully overthrew the colonial government as fears of the government aligning with the encroaching allies grew. In place of French Indochina, Japan created three short-lived puppet state kingdoms called the Kingdom of Kampuchea, the Kingdom of Lao Prabang, and the Empire of Vietnam. These three kingdoms roughly represented the three main ethnic groups of French Indochina, which brings us onto demographics of the region prior to the invasion.
In 1940, before the Japanese invasion, 23 million people lived in French Indochina. Of these 23, 14 million Vietnamese, 2 million Khmer or Cambodians, 600,000 to a million were Laotian, and an additional 6 million were made up of a plethora of smaller local groups living in the Indochinese interior, including the Hmong, the Thai, no, not that Thai, and the Chams. The majority of the population was Buddhist, specifically Mahayana and Theravada, which is notably separate from the Japanese version of Pure Land Buddhism and Shintoism.
Now that we know the people living in Indochina, how do they feel about the occupation? Well, the occupation led to mixed reactions among the populace. In northern Vietnam and Laos, massive amounts of foodstuff were distributed to the Japanese army and into power stations, leading to a famine in 1945. Additionally, a lot of the military operations in French Indochina are based out of northern Vietnam, such as invasions of Burma and incursions into Yunnan. Thus, northern Vietnam bore witness to the more militaristic side of Japanese occupation, inspiring leaders like Ho Chi Minh to rebel against Japanese and later French rule. Later, in 1945, after the Japanese dissolved the colonial French government and took direct control, a power vacuum of local power opened up in the puppet state of Vietnam. The vacuum was quickly filled by warlords and revolutionaries, especially in the north, who overthrew the Empire of Vietnam in the north during the August Revolution, beginning the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. By contrast, southern Vietnam and Cambodia saw little military action during the war, and so the populace viewed the Japanese as liberators from the oppression of the French. This key difference in the war experience is what ultimately split Southeast Asia from north to south, since the southern Indochinese had no problem with the Japanese and in fact collaborated a lot with them. Even after World War II, during the First Indochina War, many Japanese soldiers and civilians stayed in southern Indochina and even fought in the conflict, winning the respect of many Vietnamese and Khmer.
Beyond the geopolitical goals of the Japanese government, the rationale for the Japanese soldiers' actions were based around the principles of Bushido. Bushido was the moral code among soldiers and samurai of Japan, which prioritized above all else loyalty and bravery towards one's ruler. This was compounded by the fact that their ruler in question was the Emperor Hirohito, who was revered as almost divine, the direct ancestor of the Japanese sun god. For this reason, the Japanese soldiers believed full-heartedly in their cause and would do anything to fulfill their duty to the emperor. Thus, to them, their actions, such as ruthlessly killing POWs and torching villages to the ground, were seen as justifiable as it was in the service to their ultimate lord.
Okay, so now you've gotten a pretty solid picture of what was occurring in French Indochina during the Second World War. But just to test and see if you were listening, here are a few questions concerning what we just went through. Great job to anyone who got all the questions right. Hopefully you now realize why the invasion and occupation of French Indochina was a crucial part of not only the Second World War, but the rest of the 20th century.
after the fourth invasion, Japanese over northern Vietnam, the Japanese occupied the rest of Indochina. They allowed the Vichy
Amidst the colonial empires battling out, local resistance and nationalist groups were founded to resist both the French and Japanese, chief among them, the Viet Minh, or what would become the Viet Cong under Ho Chi Minh. Bro, people are gonna think I'm racist.
Whatever. No. Now you're definitely...